What if I told you the real housewives of ancient Rome weren't the ones lounging in togas, they were scrubbing marble floors with busted knees and no lunch breaks? The enslaved women of ancient Rome ran entire households like unpaid, unappreciated CEOs. These women didn't just sweep, they were nannies, seamstresses, chefs, concubines, and human alarm clocks, and some with far more intimate services that weren't exactly listed on any job scroll. But what was their everyday life really like? Buckle up as we peek behind the velvet curtain of Roman luxury. In a Roman household, especially a large one, female slaves were the first to rise, often hours before anyone else stirred. And by rise, we mean drag themselves out of bed while it's still pitch black and the chickens are hitting snooze. First order of business was rekindling the hearth fire. The focus wasn't just for cooking, it was the sacred heart of the home. Letting it go out was like letting the Wi-Fi die during a Zoom meeting with your boss's boss. You had flint, twigs, and 0 lighters. Just you, your frozen fingers, and a prayer to Vesta that the kindling catches on the first try. In winter, you were basically frostbitten. In summer, the first thing you would smell is the smoke of the fire. Then came water, gallons of it. Most Roman homes had less plumbing than a campground, so off you went, hauling buckets from public fountains. And it wasn't an easy journey. The roads were made of uneven cobblestones, and the clay buckets were very heavy. Then it was time to cook, but not a Michelin star spread, just the OG sad girl breakfast, porridge, made from barley, wheat, or whatever wasn't full of bugs. If the family was loaded, maybe you got to spice it up with some honey or chopped figs. And while the masters lounged around like extras on a reality show, you stood hunched over a clay stove, stirring bubbling sludge with a wooden paddle that doubled as a burn hazard. One wrong move and your arm would be toasted. The life of the female slaves was, thus, very difficult. Of course, no one said thank you, ever. Then came the serving, laying out dishes, pouring wine so diluted it could have passed for pink-tinted tap water, remembering which kid threw tantrums over dates and which senator wannabe insisted his wine be warmer than his ego. It wasn't just manual labor, it was mental gymnastics. You had to read the room faster than a therapist at a family reunion, smile like an emoji, and stay completely invisible until summoned. Cleaning came next. And we're not talking wipe the counter and call it a day. Marble floors got polished like a chariot before a parade. Mosaics had to be scrubbed tile by tile, dusting statues, shining bronze door handles, rearranging cushions because, yes, Romans judged your soul by your sofa. A dirty house was basically a public confession of moral decay. You couldn't yawn, couldn't sigh, couldn't even look tired. If the master got grumpy and decided the tiles weren't quite reflective enough, you could be punished before your second breath. Some women were even collared. Yeah, with actual ID tags that read, if found, return to owner. Like a lost pet, but with more chores and no cuddles. And remember, this was just breakfast. Forget me time. The closest thing to self-care was sneaking a sip of lukewarm water between tasks before someone shouted your name. Again, there was no shift to end, no punch clock, just the slow, grinding rhythm of servitude. For female slaves, exhaustion wasn't a consequence, it was the baseline. A life lived at someone else's pace, in someone else's house, with barely a whisper of your own. Let's not sugarcoat this. For many female slaves, domestic service included being forced into their master's bed. Consent wasn't even a concept. Enslaved women were considered part of the household inventory. Masters had full control. Mistresses might look the other way, or worse, take it out on the woman. It's the part of Roman domestic life they definitely don't put on marble frescoes. And if a child was born, it would get messy. Roman law considered children of enslaved mothers as property too. Some women tried to leverage this horror into survival. Becoming a concubine could sometimes offer slightly better treatment, maybe a tiny room of your own, but freedom was rare. And love? You'd have better odds finding a vegan menu at a gladiator feast. You think your group chat is elite? Roman female slaves were running a real-time cross-household information network before social media was even a twinkle in the eye of humanity. They didn't just hear gossip. They lived in the middle of it. The kitchens, the baths, the bedrooms, they were there for everything. If something scandalous went down in the villa, chances are the slaves knew about it before it happened. They were the silent observers in a world obsessed with appearances. You knew where to go if you wanted to know who was cheating, who was bankrupt, or who was plotting to poison their husband. The serving girls heard more pillow talk than a modern-day podcast host. And with fewer ads, slaves serving in elite Roman households operated like the CIA of the marble-floored world. There were body slaves who dressed their masters and overheard their mutterings, maid servants who hovered during private meetings, and bathhouse attendants who got the uncensored version of everything after 3 cups of Falernian wine. They knew who faked their lineage, who bribed whom for a political post, and which senator was secretly into goat-themed poetry. And trust, some of them used that knowledge. There are actual Roman texts complaining about enslaved women blackmailing their mistresses. That's right, ancient blackmail. One letter from a noblewoman moans about her maid threatening to expose her affair unless she was given better clothing and lighter duties. The most trusted female slaves were often sent to deliver personal letters or messages between households. If you think your email inbox is a mess, imagine a slave girl walking across town holding a love note between a politician and his neighbor's wife. That's not a message, that's a potential crime scene. And while they were officially barred from participating in politics, enslaved women had all the tea. Some were the concubines or confidants of powerful men. They'd hear Senate secrets before the senators had sobered up. And with the right connections, those secrets could be traded like gold coins, or at least used to secure a better spot by the fire during winter. They also knew the servant hierarchies within the home. There were rivalries, jealousies, alliances. Think Downton Abbey, but with more marble and less health insurance. Female slaves who had their ear to the ground could climb the social ladder of servitude by knowing who hated whom, who slept where, and who left the oil lamp burning all night. Again. So forget Twitter. The real hot takes were coming from the girl polishing the silverware while memorizing your darkest secrets. But knowing everything didn't mean you were safe. In fact, the more you knew, the more dangerous your position could become. One slip of the tongue, one raised eyebrow at the wrong mistress, and suddenly your insider status became a liability. And in Rome, when power got nervous, pain followed fast. Welcome to the dark flip side of the villa, where secrets came with a cost, and punishment was a public performance. Punishment was a regular part of life for many female slaves in Roman homes. You didn't get performance reviews, you got public humiliation and physical pain as your quarterly feedback. Punishments weren't just random, they were strategic. Roman households used them to set an example. Think of it as the worst company culture ever. The line between a mistake and an offense was blurry at best, non-existent at worst. Forgetting to refill a wine jug, speaking out of turn, or even glancing the wrong way at a guest could land you in serious trouble. Let's start with the classics. Flogging and beatings. Female slaves were routinely whipped with rods or leather lashes, but just to spice it up, sometimes it wasn't done in private. No, the Romans loved a bit of theater. You could be punished in front of other slaves to set an example. Think office meeting, but everyone's watching Cheryl get smacked for not folding the togas properly. Then there were collars. Yes, literal iron collars clamped around your neck, often with engraved instructions like, "I belong to Marcus. If found, return me." If that sounds like tagging your AirPods, just replace the AirPods with a woman and the tech with chains. These weren't punishments in the moment, they were walking billboards of shame. Oh, and good luck sleeping comfortably or looking sideways without clanging like a wind chime. Some punishments went further into the psychological horror genre. There are records of female slaves being shaved bald or having their hair cut off as a sign of disgrace. In a society where elaborate hairstyles were a huge deal, this was the ancient equivalent of forcing someone to wear Crocs with a ball gown to a gala. It marked you as untrustworthy, disobedient, and worst of all, unbeautiful, which was basically social death in Roman elite circles. Some elite households even had a designated ergastulum, a private prison on the estate where rebellious slaves were locked away. Imagine a dungeon with no Wi-Fi, no sunlight, and no chance of PTO. For female slaves, it meant being removed from the inner household entirely, stripped of any semi-stable role, and often left in the dark, literally and socially. And if you thought pregnancy might earn you leniency, think again. There are records of pregnant enslaved women being punished for laziness, as if growing a whole Roman citizen inside you didn't count as productive labor. One legal case even featured a master who claimed his enslaved woman was faking her contractions to avoid sweeping. One can't make this up. And the cherry on this blood-soaked cake? There was no HR to report to, no tribunal, no review board. The master was the law. If they had a bad day, you could become the scapegoat. If their mistress was jealous, you could be punished for being too pretty. If their kid tripped over a chair, you might be blamed for moving furniture with your eyes. The female slaves were always under scrutiny and fear of punishment. Yet, even under collars and lashes, not all enslaved women were broken. For female slaves in Roman homes, freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a goal, a strategy. A long game, played in silence, one dinner service at a time. The Romans had a system for freeing slaves called manumission, and it was the one glimmer of hope in an otherwise soul-crushing existence. Not every enslaved woman made it out, but some did beat the odds. There were several paths to freedom, and yes, many of them involved serious patience and some extremely strategic people skills. You could be freed by your owner in their will, the ancient version of "Congrats, you survived me." You could save up money through side hustles like laundry work, hairdressing, or even selling cosmetics and buy your own freedom. That's right, slaves could own money, although how they got it was often hush-hush and based on years of subtle wheeling and dealing. Some female slaves worked their way up to roles like housekeeper, wet nurse, or personal attendant, jobs that came with more visibility and, in rare cases, a tiny bit of influence. In big households, the vilica, a sort of female steward, ran the domestic show. If you were really good, your master might start thinking of you more as the help and less as human furniture, which in Roman terms was basically a promotion. And let's not ignore the elephant in the atrium, concubinage. Roman law made it easier for enslaved mothers of free-born children to earn manumission. So yes, some enslaved women turned their personal horror stories into long-term leverage, trauma, but with a business plan. Now, if they did get freed, the transformation was dramatic. A freed woman became a liberta, and she got a taste of legal personhood. Some freed women became wealthy, especially if they had a business-savvy streak or inherited from a former master. One famous tomb inscription celebrates a freed woman named Aurea Philomatia, who was remembered as both a skilled artisan and a devoted wife. That's the ancient Roman version of leaving behind a glowing LinkedIn profile and a cozy Etsy shop. In general, they could own property, make contracts, and even run a small business. Some opened taverns or bathhouses, while others sold perfumes or fabrics. Of course, even freedom came with strings. Former slaves owed a debt of loyalty to their old masters, now called patrons. So it wasn't total independence, more like getting out of your parents' house only to realize they still track your Netflix. Still, it beat being woken at dawn to scrub mosaics with vinegar. So while many enslaved women never escaped the villa walls, some managed to turn a brutal life into a victory lap. Not because the system worked, but because they worked it. So what was life really like for female slaves in Roman homes? Brutal, exhausting, clever, and human, achingly, breathtakingly human. These women weren't just background extras in someone else's story. They were the story, running the empire's homes on sweat, silence, and the occasional whispered rebellion. Thanks for watching.